It's just past 7:30 p.m. across India. Live from New Delhi, you're watching DD India Global. We'll get you top stories from India and the region. I'm Tanvi Taneja. And for news from the rest of the world, I'm joined by my colleague in Washington, D.C., Caroline Malone. Caroline, good to have you with us.
Good morning, Tanvi. It's 10 a.m. here in Washington, D.C. and 3 in the afternoon across Central Europe. Well, coming up in the next 30 minutes, we're live right outside the White House where a US-Japan bilateral summit is underway. First, the headlines.
US President Joe Biden calls Netanyahu's Gaza operation a mistake, urges Israel to call for a ceasefire. France airdrops 7 tons of aid into northern Gaza. US-Japan to strike deals on defense, space at the leaders' summit today. Philippines president says Thursday's inaugural Japan-Philippines-US trilateral summit to include South China Sea cooperation. And European lawmakers set to vote on a revamp of the bloc's migration system later today. US President Joe Biden has said that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's actions in Gaza were a mistake, particularly the strikes that killed 7 aid workers last week. In an interview to an American Spanish-language TV channel, the US President called for a ceasefire and total access for all food and medicine aid to enter Gaza. President Biden has previously said that the burden lies with Hamas to agree to a truce and hostage release deal. This is his strongest rebuke to Israel since the conflict began.
I think what he's doing is a mistake. I don't agree with his approach. I think it's outrageous that those 3 vehicles were hit by drones and taken out on a highway where it wasn't like it was along the shore. It wasn't like there was a convoy moving there, etc. So what I'm calling for is for the Israelis to just call for a ceasefire, allow for the next 6-8 weeks total access to all food and medicine going into the country. I've spoken with everyone from the Saudis to the Jordanians to the Egyptians. They're prepared to move in. They're prepared to move this food in. And I think there's no excuse to not provide for the medical and the food needs of those people. They should be done now.
Meanwhile, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken met UK Foreign Minister David Cameron in Washington on Tuesday and discussed the Rafah operations, pursuing for a ceasefire next week.
We continue to work very closely with Israel, with Egypt, with Qatar, on getting an agreement that will result in an immediate ceasefire and the release of hostages, and also create even better conditions for surging assistance to those who need it in Gaza.
Reaffirming his concerns on humanitarian access in Gaza, UK Foreign Minister David Cameron said UK's position on arms sales to Israel was unchanged.
The latest assessment leaves our position on export licences unchanged. This is consistent with the advice that I and other ministers have received, and as ever we will keep the position under review. Let me be clear though, we continue to have grave concerns around the humanitarian access issue in Gaza, both for the period that was assessed and subsequently.
Meanwhile, 8 trucks entered Gaza via the Rafah on Wednesday, the first day of Eid al-Fitr. Israel claimed 468 aid trucks moved into Gaza on Tuesday and 419 on Monday, the highest since the conflict began in October last year. Israel further said aid is moving into Gaza faster after international pressure, but is still not enough to meet the urgent humanitarian needs in the enclave. 7 tons of aid was dropped by the French military over northern Gaza on Tuesday, comprising food and basic necessities. In an open letter published in a French newspaper, Le Monde, French President Emmanuel Macron, Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi and Jordanian King Abdullah again called for an immediate ceasefire and release of all hostages. DD India's Alex Cadier has filed this report from Tel Aviv.
Well, Julia, we understand they are ongoing, but they do seem to be rather stalled. The latest we have is that the proposal that had been tabled by the CIA Director Bill Burns and broadly accepted by the Israelis has in large parts been rejected by Hamas. Now, the terms of that would have been 40 Israeli hostages released for 900 Palestinian prisoners. That's up from 700 in the last proposal. They include 100 serving life sentences in Israel. Now, on that already there's a sticking point for Hamas. They say that they do not have 40 hostages in what is known as the vulnerable category, so women, injured and elderly, that are still alive, and they do not want to reach the number of 40 by allowing men of fighting age or younger men to be released as well. So that is one point rejected by Hamas. The other, they want to be able to choose which 100 prisoners serving life sentences are released, and on that, again, they do not want Israel to have the decision to make on that particular issue. Now, the other issue, the return of civilians to northern Gaza. We know that the Israelis have increased the number of civilians they say they will allow to return to the north of the enclave, but again, Hamas saying that they do not want to see Israeli security checks on people heading back north. So these are the kind of details that are being discussed, that are being debated. At the moment, we understand the latest we have from Hamas is that the proposal does not meet their demands. They continue to study it. We understand we may have some progress, we may have some movement in the next few hours.
On to Washington now. President Joe Biden welcomed Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida to the White House on Wednesday for an official state visit. And tomorrow, White House hosts the inaugural Japan-Philippines-US Trilateral Summit. My colleague Caroline Malone is in Washington, D.C. She takes it forward from me here and gives us more also on other stories making headlines around the world. Caroline, apart from the historic Trilateral Summit on Thursday, a lot is also on the agenda between US and Japan bilateral today.
That's right. Well, US President Joe Biden is hosting the Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida at the White House for a summit that's expected to showcase closer security and economic ties between the allies. The two leaders are expected to announce measures to enhance defence cooperation in the face of China's growing might. Kishida also addressed a roundtable on critical and emerging technologies hosted by the US Chamber of Commerce in Washington on Tuesday. He said he saw opportunities for more collaboration with the United States in the next generation of computer chips.
Japan welcomes investment from the United States that push forward such cooperation in critical and emerging technology. The economic growth our country obtains through your investments shall serve as a funding source of further investments into the United States by Japanese entities.
The Minister has also been invited to address a joint meeting of Congress on Thursday. He will be just the second Japanese leader to address the body after Shinzo Abe gave a speech to Congress in 2015. Well, for more on this story, Benji Haya is joining us live from Washington. So, Benji, what are we expecting to be announced from the US-Japan state visit?
Caroline, good morning. Following some of the formalities that we've seen and heard unfold at the White House behind me, for example, a dozen or so cannons being fired off in past moments, we are expecting a raft of announcements from the two leaders in the coming 24 hours. Let me take you through them one by one. We're told by senior administration officials that firstly, the two nations will bolster their defence and security cooperation to, quote, enable an integration of their forces. In other words, far closer coordination on the defence front. Secondly, the leaders announcing important deliverables, they say, in regard to civil space cooperation. That means, excitingly, for instance, that a Japanese astronaut will become the first non-American to partake in a NASA mission to the moon. Number 3, that the two countries will announce major research partnership, the administration says, on emerging technologies, the likes of artificial intelligence, semiconductors, clean energy. That in turn will also mean far closer economic ties between the two G7 nations. And fourthly, Prime Minister Fumio Kishida and President Joe Biden will be discussing aid assistance to states like war-torn Ukraine or some of the smaller countries in the Pacific. This is all about alliance protection being transformed into alliance advancement. But amid those gains, still some strains, Caroline. For example, Japanese officials have expressed their dissatisfaction at the US administration's opposition to Nippon Steel, the Japanese company's acquisition of US steel. President Joe Biden says it is vital, quote, vital, that the industrial giant remains in American hands.
And how about Thursday, where we're expecting a trilateral summit with the Philippines? Is this as important in terms of defence agreements?
Absolutely. In fact, this is an unprecedented moment, Caroline. The first trilateral summit of its kind between these three countries, the US, Japan and the Philippines. It will include an agreement to maintain security and freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. Why is that significant? Well, as you were alluding to before, the perceived aggression, according to those three states, from Beijing, from China of late, has drawn Japan and the Philippines far closer to the United States of late. We've seen that practically. We've seen Japan, for example, committing to buying more US Tomahawk missiles. We've seen the Philippines grant American military personnel access to its islands as part of their aims to form more bases in the Indo-Pacific. And also, just over the weekend, Japan and the Philippines joining the United States in defense drills in that part of the world. China, of course, claims that as its maritime dominion. And so these are the sort of sentiments that we're being told to expect from administration officials, and we'll see outlined literally in black and white tomorrow.
Thank you, Benji. That was Benji Hire reporting from just outside the White House. Well, the Philippines President, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., on Wednesday said that the upcoming trilateral summit with the US and Japan will include an agreement to maintain security and freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. Speaking to the media, Marcos said the meeting is mainly an agreement to strengthen economic cooperation between the three countries. He further added that defence and security ties will also be discussed in the meeting. The Philippines president's upcoming visit to the US is a follow-up on Biden and Marcos's last meeting in 2023. Well, ahead of that trilateral summit, the US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said more joint patrols can be expected in the South China Sea after drills by the US, Australia, Philippines and Japan over the weekend. Warships from the four nations staged exercises on Sunday following stepped-up pressure on the Philippines by China in the disputed strategic waterway. Sullivan also said that Washington and its existing Australian and British partnerships in the AUKUS Security Pact would explore a possible Japanese involvement in the next stage of collaboration. Well, the top court in the US state of Arizona on Tuesday upheld an 1864 law that bans nearly all abortions. The court ruled 4-2 in favour of an anti-abortion obstetrician and said the 1864 law was now enforceable because there was no federal or state protections for the procedure. It outlaws abortion from the moment of conception, except when necessary to save the life of the mother, and it makes no exceptions for rape or incest. Doctors prosecuted under the law could face fines and between 2 to 5 years in prison.
Arizona's 2022 abortion ban is extreme and hurts women. And the near-total Civil War-era ban that continues to hang over our heads only serves to create more chaos for women and doctors in our state. As governor, I promised I would do everything in my power to protect our reproductive freedoms.
Well, denouncing the Arizona abortion ban, US President Joe Biden said on Tuesday that millions of Arizonans will soon live under an even more extreme and dangerous ban. Biden said this ruling is a result of the extreme agenda of Republican elected officials who are committed to ripping away women's freedom. Well, European lawmakers will vote on Wednesday to reform the bloc's migration system, which the pro-EU political centre is presenting as proof of its credibility against the far right before the bloc's June parliamentary elections. Well, members of the European Parliament will vote on 10 reform topics that make up the Pact on Migration and Asylum. It promises to cut the times for security and asylum procedures and increase rewards and reduce unwanted immigration from the Middle East and Africa, a high priority on the EU's agenda. Well, the plan was drawn up after 1.3 million people, mostly fleeing from Syria and Iraq, sought refuge in Europe in 2015. Well, as Russia deals with severe floods, waters south of Russia's Ural Mountains are rising and heading towards more regions. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said that the forecast is not favourable and President Vladimir Putin is constantly receiving updates. Well, earlier, Russia and Kazakhstan ordered more than 100,000 people to evacuate after swiftly melting snow swelled rivers beyond bursting point in the worst flooding seen there in at least 70 years. In Kazakhstan, more than 96,000 people have been evacuated so far. Well, Russia's defense ministry has released video footage of military engineers providing aid to the residents of the flooded areas in the Orenburg region. The soldiers were seen distributing packs of bottled water and food in remote villages and evacuating people from the worst affected areas. Well, Ukraine has signed a framework agreement with the UK to cooperate in the defence and arms production sectors. A meeting was attended by 30 British defence companies to discuss potential joint ventures with Ukrainian weapons and defence producers. A signed document is part of a wartime effort to build Ukraine's domestic weapons industry by working with allies. The agreement aims to benefit Ukraine's battered economy in the long term. Well, that's it from me here in Washington. Back to you in the studio, Tanvi.
Thank you very much, Caroline, for all those updates. Caroline Malone joining us from Washington, D.C. You're watching DD India Global, still to come on the show. Muslims across the world celebrate the festival of Eid al-Fitr with fervour and gaiety. India to celebrate the festival on Thursday.
Delivery boy has picked your order.
We know you are hungry. The message notification said it would take 30 minutes.
We can't just rely on a message.
Didn't you sell some shares yesterday?
Yes. So
did you check them?
I got a message.
You can't just rely on one message. If you make any transactions in the stock market, cross-check the SMS or email you received from the stock exchange with your Demat account as well as bank statement.
Beta, when one's hungry, the brain doesn't function properly.
सोच कर, समझ कर, invest कर.
Opposition stuns Erdogan with historic victory in Turkish local poll. Will the defeat
Welcome back. You're watching DD India Global. I am Tanvi Taneja. And now we are cutting across live to Washington, D.C., where the US-Japan bilateral meeting is getting underway.
Our beacons of freedom
shining across the globe, and the ties of friendship, family, connect the Japanese and American people as a source of joy, meaning, and meaning for millions, millions of our people.
今日、私たちの経済面での関係は世界で最も強く深いものです。私たちの民主主義国家は世界中に輝く自由の鏡火でもあります。そしてアメリカ人と日本人をつなぐ友情や家族は何百万人もの日米市民にとっての喜びと意義の源でもあります。
Japanese Americans have made historic contributions across American life for generations. And that includes my mentor and one of my closest friends ever in the United States Senate, Senator Daniel Inouye, a decorated war hero, a U.S. Senator for nearly 50 years, and a recipient of the Medal of Honor. Yesterday, Prime Minister laid a wreath at the National Japanese American Memorial in honor of Danny Inouye's 100th birthday, something I truly appreciate you having done.
日系アメリカ人は何世代にもわたりアメリカの生活に多大な貢献をしてきました。その貢献者の一人に私の最も親しい恩師並びに友人のダニエル・井上がいます。彼は戦争の英雄で50年近くにわたり上院議員を務め、名誉勲章の受章者でもありました。昨日、総理は彼の100周年の誕生日を記念し、全米日系米国人記念碑に献花されました。これには本当に心から感謝いたします。
Mr. Prime Minister, you and I have been entrusted with protecting and advancing the monumental alliance between our two great democracies. Together, we made it closer, stronger, and more effective than ever before in history. I thank you, Mr. Prime Minister, for your partnership, your leadership, and your personal friendship.
So those are the joint statements being made by US President Joe Biden and Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida at the White House. The US-Japan summit is underway. All right, let's move on now. The Indian Council for Cultural Relations, ICCR, honoured the winners of an international competition that saw participation from 7 countries. They represent various performing arts disciplines. Through such diverse initiatives, the ICCR endeavours to commemorate the depth of Indian culture while promoting dialogue and collaboration on a global scale.
It's always beautiful to come to India, to inherit your culture through my music, through tabla, because we in Russia, we organize music events, concerts, and promoting the art in Russia. But it was pleasant experience. It's a great way how we can connect with the foreign artists who are, promoting Indian art, traditional art abroad. And so that also we know that here, the India also knows about us, and kind of we doing the exchange between our, daily life, being busy with other things and music, and being invited to India, it feels like we appreciate it, which is inspiring.
There are a lot of Indians living in Malaysia, and so I find it a little bit difficult to connect to the style initially. But yet I'm very drawn to it. So I've only learned Kathak for 2 years. This is my 2nd year. But yet I keep finding myself wanting to come back to India. So yeah, it's a wonderful experience here, seeing Kathak dance in India.
I'm very honored to get first prize in Bharatanatyam. It was very nice opportunity to perform in India, and as Japanese, representing as Japanese.
All right, Muslims around the world have begun celebrating Eid al-Fitr, one of the biggest celebrations in the Islamic calendar. Eid al-Fitr, which means festival of the breaking of the fast, is celebrated at the end of Ramadan, a month of fasting for many Muslims. It's a time for spiritual reflection, to show kindness to one and all, and establish one's relationship with God. In India, the festival will be celebrated at most places on Thursday. So with that, it's a wrap in this edition of DD India Global. Do let us know your thoughts on the news of the day. You can connect with us on our different social media handles. I'm Tanvi Taneja from all of us here. Thank you for watching. Namaskar.